Joining me tonight. This is the middle ground. I'm Elizabeth Ferguson. I have 10 years of political experience across the Atlantic, and I am finally ready to give you my analysis of the situation surrounding Ukraine. I have been sitting back and observing and analyzing for several weeks, and before wanting to say anything officially, make any. I did do a review last week of the Biden Schultz press conference in DC, which I'll link below. But it was really just responding to what they were discussing rather than giving you my full analysis of the situation. I am finally ready, and now I'm feeling fairly confident about what I've put together. And I have some issues about the way things are going down in the US politically that I also want to get into because it's pertinent and it's relevant to the conclusion. So, what I'm going to do is give you some historical context. I want to describe the situation we have going on, and then I will get to what I feel is the only step forward to resolution. Because I know a lot of people have been anxious, have thought this is a World War III event. I'll get into that as well, get into some of my own personal family background and help you understand a lot of those who have been anxious, who are not familiar with foreign affairs or military tactics, what classifies as a World War III event. Because I know a lot of people have been really anxious that this looks like a World War III event. So there are potentially some World War III events that could happen. And there definitely is a tense situation that could get worse before it gets better. So stick with me. Try to follow me through the process. If you really want to understand, go to the end, and I will be discussing ramifications, particularly what the U.S. can do at this point, which is not a lot of options, and why the political situation in the U.S. is tied together with what's going on in the Ukraine. Okay, let's get started. First of all, so I mentioned that I'm going to get into my own family background. So my family's been facing off in Russian standoffs for half a century. My father was flying anti-recon in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So he had a very firsthand experience. He said, actually, since the media coverage was so bad, not unlike now with the Ukraine, he would go up in the air to know what was going on strategically, know what was going on in the U.S. politically, because he was down in Cuba, stationed at the Bay of Pigs. So, my family's been having Russian standoffs for quite a few decades. So I did have a chat with him today, and I have a great perspective about how this situation does or does not compare to the Cuban Missile Crisis. At this point, it doesn't really, because it is a military standoff with Russia, but that's kind of where some of the similarities end, actually. So, a really great perspective from my father, who was an advisor to the admiral in the Navy in his naval career. So the historical context I want to get into is my father agrees that the U.S. did start this conflict in Ukraine. So the U.S. Made a mistake. In 2014, there was a very popular elected official leading the Ukraine, and he happened to be pro-Russia. And the U.S. got involved in overthrowing him. So that was where this tension started, with Ukraine at the center. The U.S. did cause it. So nobody's denying that. And the response when Putin annexed Crimea was in response to the U.S.'s political meddling. True. All of those things are true statements. Putin did believe or understand, he learned after that experience that he could take over Crimea with no consequences. So I think the difference now is that there's not anything particularly current sparking a new aggression toward him. Like the US hasn't done anything currently in the Ukraine that's anti-Russia. So before there was a cause and effect. And since then, he has been unhappy with the US. We've seen that in 2013. He was publishing this article in the New York Times telling the US what to do. Of course, all of us saw this and we're like, what are you talking about? But it was obviously because the US was involved with the Ukraine situation politically. And then, of course, he had talked about how Hillary Clinton and Obama were out to get him and were responsible for all of these evils against Russia. And then, of course, he took on the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016, working with Assange, or somebody was working with Assange to plot things against her to try to make her fail. So he definitely has a beef with the West, specifically the US. More relevantly is the NATO question. He is surrounded on all sides by countries that are now part of NATO. And he doesn't like it. And that is an understandable situation. Putin does not want to be surrounded on all borders by countries who are part of NATO. And so the Ukraine has a large border with him. The Ukraine has said clearly, there's no question. I know there's been a lot of misinformation. A foreign minister from the Ukraine did make a misstatement. It is in the constitution of Ukraine and in their long-term strategy that they do want to join NATO. So Putin does not like that. Putin does not want the Ukraine to join NATO. He is trying to make that not happen. So that's Putin's number one motivation. I want to state, because so many people have seen him say that he's not intending to invade Ukraine, and there's no intelligence for the US to respond or say that he plans to invade. And it's, first of all, you should never believe anything Putin says. He will never tell you what his true intentions are, right? He will never tell you what he actually wants, which is why I'm going to get into, if I were Putin, here's what he actually wants to do. So first of all, never believe anything Putin says about what he intends to do or his actual motivations or what he actually wants is. He's purposely misleading. This is part of his foreign policy tactics. There's nothing new here. He's been doing this for over 10 years. The amount of people who were criticizing Biden because Putin said he would not invade Ukraine today have been ridiculous. Rand Paul even got into this, and I want to bring this up later at the end when I get into the US political interference, why this is tied in. So Putin will not tell anybody what he wants, but we do know that there was a legislative motion in the Russian parliament about the regions close to the border or on the border with Russia in the Ukraine, which are Russian speaking, and they wanted to declare these, become independent from the Ukraine and become a part of Russia. That is his motivation. So I think everyone knows that he's going after these regions in the Ukraine near the border. So I do want to just pull up a map of the Ukraine so everyone can visualize exactly where this is. And you can see the southeast corner is right next to Crimea. So right now Crimea is a peninsula, and so we know where Sochi, where the Olympics were held, is also on the Black Sea. Further south is part of Siberia. And Crimea is this peninsula on the Black Sea. But Putin doesn't actually have access to Crimea by land. And that's what this southeast corner of the Ukraine provides for him. So this is his motivation. He wants to annex this region of the Ukraine to get to Crimea. This is what his whole intention of this whole exercise is. He learned that he could annex Crimea before, no consequences. He expects to do it again. This situation is much more complex for him politically than Crimea was, because Crimea was an isolated peninsula. So it's a kind of a cloistered region of the Ukraine that could kind of be handled in its own chunk. It's going to be very difficult for Putin to try to annex just this part of the Ukraine. First of all, it will create a domino effect of what he doesn't want to happen. So if he annexes this part of the Ukraine, you can guarantee the rest of the Ukraine will immediately join NATO. Because he's showing NATO was formed after World War II to protect Europe from Russia. So personally, if I'm Putin, I don't want to be surrounded by NATO, but it really poses no threat. NATO is not ever going to seek out military aggression toward Russia. So countries on the border with Russia being part of NATO pose no actual threat to Putin, unless his motivation is to invade those countries. If his motivation that he wants to do is to invade those countries, then those countries being a part of NATO and NATO coming to protect those countries poses a problem to him. But if he just is interested in protecting Russia and not invading Europe, then those countries becoming part of NATO should actually not pose any problem to him. Just basic logic, right? It's only a problem unless they're imposing a goal that he actually wants to achieve. So he's faced with this dilemma. He doesn't want the Ukraine to be part of NATO, but he does want this corner of the Ukraine to get to Crimea. If he annexes that, the rest of Ukraine will absolutely join NATO immediately. So either way, he loses, and he doesn't get entirely what he wants. The only way he'd be able to avoid the rest of the Ukraine join NATO when he annexed this corner would be to capture the whole country, which is a problem because the west of Ukraine doesn't want to be ruled by Russia. They don't speak Russian, unlike the corner near Ukraine. To prevent it from joining NATO and get access to Crimea, he faces a civil war because definitely the parts in the west do not want to have Russia ruling them anymore again. So he has learned in Afghanistan, civil wars get very messy and he doesn't want to mess around with them. That means that he probably doesn't know how things are going to go for him. Of course, basic strategy is don't tell your opponent what you're planning to do, but he may have a number of contingencies and it could go sideways very quickly for him. So that he may be trying to get his ducks in a row, figure out what he needs to see or wants to see in place before he makes his move. But he's definitely planning to invade. And this is what he wants. This is his motivation. He faces a dilemma because there's really not a way for him to get both of the things he wants at the same time without having to face a civil war, which he won't like to do. That brings us to the question of his demands. He claims that what he wants from the West to de-escalate this is to assure him that the Ukraine will not join NATO. Well, the Ukraine has definitely said it's in our constitution. It's part of our long-term strategy. We want our plan to join NATO. The problem is it doesn't matter what the U.S. says. Even if the U.S. told Russia what they wanted to hear, it wouldn't be a guarantee. The U.S. cannot speak on behalf of NATO, say we guarantee the Ukraine will not join. Yes, the U.S. is one of the leaders in NATO, but it just doesn't, it's not possible. There are over 20 countries in NATO. Nobody can give a guarantee that the Ukraine would never join. So it may be somewhat of a smokescreen. Putin knows what he intends to do. He knows what his motivation is and his agenda is. Ideally, he would love to roll into Ukraine and do this like he did in Crimea, but it is a much more complicated situation. Crimea was an isolated peninsula. didn't have to face the wrath of the whole country when he did that. So, claiming that, oh yeah, he's definitely played around with puppets. He's played around with Macron. He's played around with Baerbock from Germany, and they've eaten it up. And it's really not flattering for them to just kind of let him pat them on the head and have them say, oh yeah, he's fine. Not a good look for you guys. So he may be using this as a smokescreen to say, well, if the U.S., to buy time while he gets everything in order, just tell everybody the U.S. needs to meet my demands, or which they can't do, and then use that as an excuse that for not removing his army. So today what we saw was the foreign minister for Russia already saying, well, if the Ukraine is attacked, then of course we'd have a legitimate reason to go in to the Ukraine. And my father pointed out, Hitler perfected the tactics in 30s and 40s of making excuses for why his army needed to go roll into other countries. Mocked up political excuses. So this is not new in history that Russia is using this tactic. So it's clear, like, they're already setting the pretext. They're already setting up an excuse that they want to use when they do roll into the Ukraine. People have asked, there's been a lot of criticism about the Biden administration today, which has been crazy and reminded me a lot of the whole misinformation, creating lack of constructive dialogue in Don't Look Up. And let's be honest, Putin has learned that this works in the U.S. and just get people to fight and ignore the problem and turn on each other, and he gets to do whatever he wants. So he has learned a lot of things coming up to this. He learned that he went into Crimea and annexed it without any consequences. He's learned how to get the U.S. people distracted. And he's employing those tactics now. So there's a lot of this misinformation floating around saying Biden doesn't have intelligence. Biden is using this as a distraction. So we want to get into this a little bit. So first of all, the intelligence. You don't need much intelligence. They're visual images via satellite where there are hundreds of thousands of troops along the border. And these are the top-notch military units. Come all the way from the other side of Siberia. These are like the Navy SEALs of Russia's army or military. Sorry, Army Rangers, the best of the best. That's who he's brought to the border. And he's running drills in the airspace for intimidation. More importantly, he has set up field hospitals. So you don't set up field hospitals for drills where nobody gets injured. You only set up field hospitals when you are preparing for conflict where you know you will have casualties. So Biden and the other countries seeing that there is an imminent threat have evidence. It is not a lie. The eyes of the amount of crazy people saying, well, just believe Putin because he said he wouldn't invade. I mean, really, people. So Biden would not have chosen this time. People are accusing Biden of using this as a distraction from other issues like inflation, for example. First of all, Biden did not manufacture this conflict. This conflict has been leading up for several weeks. Secondly, Biden wouldn't choose this time of year. Putin always invades the Ukraine in February. If you have ever studied Russian history, you know why. Because in February, the ground is frozen, and that is ideal conditions for rolling tanks across it. So when Putin invaded Crimea, it was in February. It's in February now where he's brought in his military to invade now. Biden Nothing has to do with Biden manufacturing any of this. Putin attacks and has military aggression in February. That's his MO. Secondly, people who claim that Biden administration is using this to divert from inflation, I want to address that. Biden would not make this up because the markets have been going haywire. If Putin did invade the Ukraine, it would cause a crash in the markets. Right now, the situation with inflation is delicate. They are working to balance the situation with inflation, the inflation problem, to try to make sure that the markets do not crash at a level that cannot be recovered. So, since they are fragile, the situation where this might cause additional strain on the markets is not something they would purposely want to create. I am curious if there are potential opportunities to reverse that and use options to kind of reverse that direction. But first of all, I'll get to that later, but that's also a question for economists. Even though I give them a bad rap, I would be curious what they would have to say about this issue. So Biden is not making this up. He's not manufacturing this. He has very little options at this point to de-escalate. So my father is traditionally very critical, historically, of the way the Democratic Party handles foreign affairs and foreign policy. And my father has been impressed that this administration has done everything they can to handle this situation in the right way. That is a very difficult situation that really can't be won. Because Putin will do what Putin wants to do. And he will use these negotiation tactics as a smokescreen and hope that he gets the outcome he wants, which is already going to be complex for him. So the Biden administration has handled this difficult situation the best way that it can in the current situation. There's not a lot of options for them at this point. At this point, we have a massive, top-notch military, the best of the best military units on Russian side, lined up along the Ukrainian border, unopposed. The Ukrainian has some defense forces, nothing that can match up to the caliber and size of the Russian army who will invade. So there's no defense army along the border to do that. And I found this kind of circular argument to be problematic. So because Ukraine is not a member of NATO, NATO is not obligated to defend them. But that's kind of a shitty thing to say since the Ukraine is in this situation because they want to join NATO. So it's kind of shitty to leave them high and dry because they're in the situation because they want to join NATO, but because they're not in NATO, NATO might not or has no obligation to defend them. I mean, come on. That's really a shitty situation for somebody who wants to be your ally. The U.S. is in a difficult situation because here's a question I pose. If the U.S. is responsible for creating this conflict, right? So the U.S. created this conflict because of meddling in the politics in the Ukraine. And the Ukraine, it has led to consequences that does not make Ukraine happy. Ukraine does not like being harassed by Russia constantly. And should it be the responsibility of the United States to defend the Ukraine from harassment that the U.S. caused? That's the question I would pose. The problem is that Biden cannot bring in an army to match the Russian army because he doesn't have the public support at home. And I want to get to that because that's going to tie into the political situation in the U.S. So in my opinion, the only leverage that Biden could potentially have to de-escalate this and cause Putin to call off the army is to match The Russian army with the military force that was there to defend the Ukraine on the other side of the border. People are curious about when we get to a World War III event. So as I mentioned, in 2014, the US could have defended Crimea, did not do so. At this point, if the US tried to retake Crimea, that would be a World War III event. If the US or NATO were to line up a matching sized military force to match Russia, and then you would have equal forces on either side of the border, that would not still be a World War III event. We would not be at a World War III event yet. It would be very tense. It could potentially be as tense as the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it would not be a World War III event yet. Just to have a stalemate where you have two militaries that do not want to engage and start World War III. It is in no one's best interest to start World War III because there is no way to end World War III without using nuclear weapons, and that would not be a one-sided fight, and it would be a lose-lose situation for everyone involved. So the only potential de-escalation I see to cause Putin to call off his army is to match his military forces with a defensive force. Biden has his hands tied at the moment because he does not have public support at home to do that. But I do see that as the only possible way at this point to de-escalate the situation. So just to recap, Putin plans to invade, has specific motivations that he wants to achieve, is using the negotiations as a smokescreen, asking for demands that can't be met. It's not possible to guarantee that the Ukraine will not join NATO. So I want to turn to the situation in the US political climate as part of this situation at the moment. I mentioned that Rand Paul has been stirring up problems about criticizing Biden, that Putin said he wouldn't invade. So it does, and MAGA has been going crazy, right? MAGA has been really accusing the Biden administration of all of these diversion tactics from the problems at home. Well, as I've mentioned, Biden didn't create the problem. He would not choose to use this specific instance to divert from inflation because this could hurt the inflation problem more. So this would not be a tactic any president would use to distract from the domestic problems. I would say and Biden did not choose the timing because Putin always invades the Ukraine in February. So Biden did not choose the timing of this particular conflict. If I were to look at something that was timed to coincide with this conflict to create a diversion tactic, what I'm seeing is that Trump has his friend Durham stir up some problems with Hillary Clinton's emails, or Hillary Clinton again. And the timing of that and the fact that Trump is trying to stir up so much about that timing seems very intentional. So the timing of the conflict in the Ukraine is not something Biden had any control over. It's something that was entirely dictated by Putin and Russian military history, that you always have a war in the winter when the ground is frozen. However, this Durham report could have been released at any time, and the timing of that and all of the attention he's trying to stir up and draw, particularly in the MAGA group, that seems very intentional. That seems like a diversion. So I wanted to bring up this false comparisons that the Republicans frequently use about the Democrats. So for several years, there have been concerns that the former president and some members of the Republican Party were somehow very pro-Russia. And so that's what's concerning when I see MAGA being stirred up to be very pro-Russia in this scenario. Causes me a lot of questions, raises a lot of red flags for me. That here the U.S. is trying to help a situation were responsible for creating, trying to get the Russian army to stand down. And suddenly all of this pro-Russian stuff coming from the Republican Party appears on the horizon. So when I try to discuss any of this concern with my father, he always counters by saying that the Democratic Party has ties to the Chinese Communist Party. So he always tries to draw these parallel similarities between Russian ties to the Republican Party and Chinese Communist Party ties to the Democratic Party. And I said, if this falls apart in this situation, because there is also a war looming on the horizon with China over Taiwan. The U.S. does have a treaty with Taiwan and is bound to defend them from aggression from China. So if we were at that scenario, if it was China threatening to invade Taiwan, nobody in the Democratic Party would be trying to stir up pro-China propaganda. If the president of China was saying he did not plan to invade when he had a massive army of his best troops prepared to invade Taiwan, nobody in the Democratic Party would be saying, oh, we should listen to his claims that he's not planning to invade instead of taking action. So that's where this parallel attempt to compare the Democratic Party, their ties to the Republican Party falls apart. Because what we have today is the Republican Party being very pro-Russia, saying that we needed to believe Putin when he says he won't invade. You would never see this in a comparative scenario with the Democratic Party if it were China on the line. So I want to make that very clear because there's a lot of false comparison with the supposed ties the Democratic Party has to the Chinese Communist Party. What we're seeing this weekend are explicitly pro-Russian discussions from the Republican Party, particularly surrounding this report and trying to focus on this report instead of the conflict in the Ukraine. So my father said there are a lot of people in the Republican Party who are not pro-Russia, but they are not the ones speaking and making lots of noise this weekend. So it does call into question if Biden needs support at home to have the leverage to put an army in place to have a standoff with the Russian military, and the Republican Party is trying to prevent that public support at home from happening, what is their real agenda? Why do they not want the United States to have a military standoff with Russia? And I want to draw one specific public safety hazard that is coming out of this attack. They're levying at the Democrats. My friend Jake Sullivan is trying to save people's lives. He's trying to get U.S. citizens out of the conflict zone. And so Fox even covered that report that he released. But it was right after Fox had covered this report with his Durham report. And so people ask, oh, well, is he even trustworthy? So they're calling into question their national security advisor who's trying to save people's lives, trying to say he's not trustworthy because of all of this pro-Russian propaganda that the Republican Party is stirring up. And if you think I'm being crazy, I'm just looking at correlations, right? I'm just observing timing. I'm observing what exactly is being disrupted. So if you want to accuse the Biden administration of diverting or distracting away from inflation, the timing is all wrong for that to be intentional. If you want to accuse the Republican Party for being pro-Russian and trying to distract from giving Biden the support at home that he would need to de-escalate this situation by sending in military, that timing is on point. So I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm just asking you to look at the timing and the correlation of what is being impacted and what is not, or what is not intentionally being impacted. What the timing is not intentionally doing damage to. I got tangled up in that, I think. I think that draws me to the conclusion and summarizes my analysis of the situation. Again, I feel very confident about this, particularly seeing the retaliation from the pro-Russian sector trying to stir up the MAGA people. I feel it's really sad that this group of MAGA supporters needs to make this about them. I think it just makes them look like they're very thirsty and they just want attention all the time. Because as I've talked before about the people who are living in this region being very concerned for their safety, Putin has now told Russian citizens to move out of the area, trying to get his own citizens out of danger and out of a conflict zone. So I think what all the Biden administration is saying is that this is a volatile situation with a very imminent threat. I have explained to you, Putin will never tell you what he intends to do or what his real motivations are, but I've told you what they most likely are, and that he absolutely intends to take action, military action, if there is not a military force on the other side of the border opposing him that can oppose him, which is not the current state of the Ukraine military. Thank you for joining me. I'm glad that I finally was able to deliver this report to you all. I hope that I've clarified for those of you who have been anxious about when exactly do we start panicking about World War III, helping distinguish some of the differences between what would escalate a World War III event and what is just incredibly tense and we hope does not escalate a World War III event. So yes, it is an anxious time, very similar, could be very similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis, but we really are not at near a World War III event yet. We could be if if there were two militaries of the same size facing off in a stalemate, but we at this point are not there. At this point, it would require the Republican Party to get on board. I think potentially the Republican Party could be motivated by the economic stability question. So I mentioned I would come back to this. I would be curious to see if the U.S. were to take counter-military measures to set up a defensive military force against the Russian army, would that help stabilize the economy and help reduce risk to the fragile inflation situation? So I would love to see an economist's perspective on that. My second question is, everyone has already acknowledged that China is watching to see how the U.S. responds to this situation. Sending a clear message to China is something that the Republican Party has also as a motivation. Can that be a unifying force to give Biden the support at home he needs? I don't know. But those are my two thoughts on where there might be bipartisan support for military action and how the people at home might be motivated to give Biden the support that he would need to have the leverage to get the Russian army to stand down and de-escalate the situation. I know it's tense times. Thanks for joining me here. It's been a lot of information to process to get this to you, so I hope it was helpful. Have a great day.